By some estimates, there are 50,000 mercenary troops fighting on Russia's behalf in Ukraine as part of the Wagner Group, a shadowy Russian outfit with international reach and roots that go back to 2014. Founded by Putin's ally Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Wagner Group is believed to get its name from another man behind the organization, a former Russian military officer whose call sign was Wagner, in honor of the German composer much beloved by Adolf Hitler. To help us understand the roots of the Wagner Group and the role it is playing in Ukraine today, I want to bring in Shaun, Central and Eastern European correspondent for The Guardian, and Fred Pleitgen, CNN's senior international correspondent. Welcome both. Shaun, you have this fascinating, lengthy profile of Prigozhin. Explain to us, really, where does it begin?
Yeah, I mean, Prigozhin is a fascinating personality who's very unlike any of the other people in Putin's inner circle. He spent most of his 20s in the 1980s in jail. Then he became a hot dog seller in St. Petersburg. He started setting up restaurants. And at some point when Putin, back in the late 90s, was deputy mayor of Petersburg, he started eating at Prigozhin's restaurant. Seemed to take a liking to this guy. Before long, Prigozhin was catering meetings between Putin and other leaders. And then somehow he gets into this inner circle. And in 2014, when the Kremlin takes the decision, Putin takes the decision to annex Crimea and to start that first invasion of Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, which is very different from the one we saw last year. They are trying to keep it covert. They're denying that there are any Russian troops on the ground, even though, you know, all of us that were reporting there at the time could see there obviously were Russian troops. But clearly in the Kremlin, they started to think, well, what can we do to have a bit more plausible deniability, to be able to intervene and deny that really we're there? And I think that's really the genesis of the Wagner idea. Some point in the spring of 2014, there's a meeting in the Ministry of Defense, and Prigozhin is given this whole set bit of land where he can train fighters. And later on, this group will grow and grow and turn into the Wagner Group.
And Fred, you've been covering it for a long time yourself. They explain the Africa connection. What is the Wagner Group doing in Africa?
Well, the Wagner Group is essentially training African armies. Just a couple of days ago, I actually interviewed two Russian convicts who have been drafted into Wagner to fight in Ukraine. And they told me at those training bases, which Shaun was just mentioning, that their trainers there were actually Wagner mercenaries who had before that been in the Central African Republic to train those militaries there.
And Shaun, when we've been referring to them as mercenaries. And in the Africa case, there really seems to be an outright, I mean, it reminds me of, some of those old, the East India Company or something. They're just being given mines or mineral concessions, right?
That's right, yeah. And I mean, part of this is Prigozhin's personal ambition, and he has clearly done extremely well out of this. But you obviously can't separate this from the Russian state. And I think, I think one of the really key things to look at when it comes to Wagner is like a lot of what Putin does, he is doing things that he thinks that the West and specifically the Americans are doing. So where Putin thinks that the Americans are meddling in Russian affairs, so he says, okay, I'm going to meddle in US affairs. Putin thinks that the Americans do up to all kinds of shadowy stuff around the world that they can then deny. Okay, so Russia needs a mechanism to do that. And I think a really revealing answer that Putin gave back in 2018 when he was asked by quite an unusual combative interview, I think, with Austrian television. And eventually Putin says, well, in the US, you have somebody called George Soros, and the US State Department claims that it has nothing to do with Mr. Soros. And in the same way, I claim that I have nothing to do with Mr. Prigozhin. He's just an ordinary restaurant keeper with a sort of wink. So basically what you have is Putin kind of buying into these conspiracy theories that actually George Soros is working for the deep state, is an arm of US foreign policy. And he's saying, okay, well, if that's what I think the Americans are doing, I'm going to do that too.
And Fred, what is the Wagner Group doing in Ukraine? What have you observed?
Well, certainly, if you look at Yevgeny Prigozhin here in Ukraine, I think there's essentially two things. I mean, they are a very tough fighting force on the ground, especially right now, if you look at the area around Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. But a lot of this is also, it seems very much, about Yevgeny Prigozhin increasing his position, bettering his position, especially, of course, trying to appeal to Vladimir Putin among the other people who are also trying to do the same, like, for instance, Putin's generals. If you look at the situation around Bakhmut, I spent a lot of time on the ground with Ukrainian fighters who have come face to face with Wagner mercenaries, and they essentially say, look, the reason why Wagner is able to gain ground on the battlefield is because their tactics are so brutal and so in disregard of human life that it's very difficult to defend against them. I met one Ukrainian soldier who told me that his group of about 20 Ukrainian soldiers was up against 200 roundabout Wagner mercenaries. Now, a lot of them are people who are convicts who are immediately recruited out of jail and thrown on the battlefield. And the way that Wagner does this, and I've cross-checked this with captured Wagner fighters who told me exactly the same thing, is that you have these convicts who are in what's called the first couple of waves, which the Ukrainians say is essentially cannon fodder. They try to assault positions head on, each group trying to gain a little more ground while there's massive attrition rates of up to 80% of these guys. And at some point, these Ukrainian fighters are, of course, worn down by having to fight off these waves. And then Wagner does have specialized forces, very capable forces, that then try to attack from the flanks. On top of that, Wagner now has an air force. Yevgeny Prigozhin was just seen inside an aircraft saying he himself was on a mission to bomb Bakhmut. And they also have long-range artillery. And in all these places, Fareed, what we're seeing increasingly, and I think this really shows that Yevgeny Prigozhin is sort of trying to come out of those shadows that Shaun was just talking about. So it certainly seems as though a lot of this is about public relations for Yevgeny Prigozhin, but it's also, if you will, a desire to show that this is the only force right now in Ukraine that can get real results for Vladimir Putin, Fareed.
Fred, Shaun, this is a fascinating spotlight on something I don't think any of us knew enough about. Thank you so much. Next on GPS, my next guest says the White House needs to confront North Korea about its growing nuclear advances now.